Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm really honored to be here. It's the first time that I've been to Mary's Knoll, and as John mentioned, I met Father Dennis Cleary. I think it was in 1994, and I was an undergrad. Let's see, I had just graduated from Notre Dame, was a candidate with Holy Cross for a year, and then came back after discerning not to go into priesthood, but to continue on with my education as an artist. And at the time, I was finishing up this piece, and I'll talk about that in a second. So it's really this sculpture that brought me here. So I stand before you, if you don't mind me reading my remarks, just to make sure I could go forever on each of these sculptures. I stand before you today because of a sculpture I made 34 years ago. In 1992, I was a seminarian, as I mentioned, at Moreau Seminary across St. Joe's Lake from the University of Notre Dame. I was in my candidate year of discernment, learning from priests like John Donne, who was bringing music and theology together in ways that opened hearts. And I was inspired to do something similar, bringing visual art and theology together. In that year, a Dominican sister, Sister Joris Binder, she was the rectoress at Pascarilla East Hall. She asked me to create a crucifix for their chapel, and I made this sculpture, which I called The Lover and the Beloved. A few years later, I gave it to Father Dennis and Maryknoll, who I met at Notre Dame at that time. He was on sabbatical. And we lost touch after a few years, and I didn't know what happened to the sculpture. I assumed maybe after he passed, it was lost or perhaps destroyed, which happens. And for decades, it really only existed in my memory and in the reflections I had written about it. Then a couple years ago, I met Father John Civilon and at the University of Scranton, and he knew Father Dennis, of course, and he told me that it was here. And that discovery, that reunion became the seed for me for this morning. And so John invited us with Declan and Christian and Cyrus to share our work with you. And as I prepared, I realized this reunion with this sculpture is itself a parable of what I want to talk to you about today. Because this sculpture began an adventure of learning about kenosis, about self-emptying, about letting go, about loss and vulnerability. And what I've learned in the years since is that kenosis it's not the end. And as I prepared, I realized the reunion with this sculpture is itself about what is the end? Theosis, or divinization, transformation. So this morning I want to talk with you, or walk with you through just a part of my journey as an artist and as a person of faith, from that first sculpture in 1992 to this 40-foot sculpture you just witnessed, 11 tons that I finished in 2017. It's a journey that traces a path my mentor, Father John, described as the 4 cycles of story and song, and from original unity through separation from the earth, and then the emergence of autonomy and individualism to a final reunion, from kenosis to theosis. And I want to share this journey with you who have spent your lives in mission, in service, in walking with the excluded, because you know this path intimately, more than I. You live it. You know what it means when those who do the essential work, the feet of the body, are pushed to the margins. You know what it costs to walk with them at their pace, learning from below rather than teaching from above. So let me take you back to that time. I was 22 years old, first-year seminarian, trying to discern whether I was called to be a priest or religious life, and studying theology. But I was also an artist and a sculptor in, at that time, clay, bronze, wood. I was learning from extraordinary people like John Donne, Michael Himes, Don McNeil, many others that talked and demonstrated what it was like to love as Jesus loves. And John was particularly, as I mentioned, influential for me. He believed that music was the original language of creation, that in the beginning all things were at one and we could understand the language of the birds. And he composed songs that were really prayers, and he would perform them in class and in concerts. And I was privileged to sing with him in some of his concerts. I also sing and as a tenor. So while at Monroe Seminary, as part of my discernment, I was involved with hospice and visiting folks, of course, who had 6 months or less to live. And I met a man named Steve. Steve was 36 years old, a military veteran. He was dying of AIDS. He had known since 1986 he was HIV positive. And for 6 years, he'd lived with anger and fear and pain and regret. And it wasn't just the disease. He was being shoved aside by our society because he was gay. And in spending time with Steve those few months, I learned one real kind of fundamental lesson, that we're more alike than we're different. Steve was hurt and broken. He was hungering for life, acceptance, and he was longing to be loved and healed. And I realized I'm like that. I think we all are. We reach out in our darkness, hoping to grab hold of anything to stabilize our uncertainty. We're hungry and we don't know where to get the food. So when I made this sculpture, The Lover and the Beloved, I was trying to express what I was learning from Steve. I was trying to speak about things not seen or heard, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and our relationship with the eternal, the infinite, God as infinite, unbounded love. And you might look at this sculpture when you have a chance to come up, walk around it. You can see two hands, the larger hand reaching upward, grasping, desperate. As I was thinking about this hand, I was looking at my hand and sculpting that, thinking about how that is an image of aspiration, of longing, our desire for stability. And there's a smaller hand behind it, supporting, holding, drawing us into relationship. And that, for me, is God's hand. And I made it a female hand because I wanted to emphasize the divine feminine. God is like a lover who loves her beloved, and we are that beloved. And between them is Jesus, stripped, vulnerable, crucified. I actually, being intimate with Steve in terms of clothing him and helping him and so forth, saw a very emaciated body, much like this one that inspired that crucifix or that corpus. And so you might also notice on this, when you come around, you'll see an angel. Her wings are sort of swirling around on either side of the male hand. And she embraces Jesus' side. Her hair flows towards the wounds. The nature, I guess I was thinking about the nature of love, that it always is attracted to that which doesn't have love. The hunger of our hearts is a magnet of love. Love is automatically attracted to it. So when I was writing the reflections today for this, about this sculpture, after all this time of being apart from it, I kept coming back to Francis of Assisi and his encounters with Lady Poverty, because Francis understood something profound about the nature of love and the divine feminine, something I've come to see through 3 different spiritual traditions that inform my work, my work as an artist, a teacher, and a scholar. These 3 traditions are Catholic mysticism, the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and Sufism reoriented, a small Sufi order founded by Meher Baba. I think I have an image of this. And between all of these traditions, it's really the divine feminine who guides this way towards what John Donne called reunion. And I recently saw the Venus of Willendorf in Vienna, and was just so taken with this ancient sculpture, this 3-inch, maybe 2.5-inch sculpture, but in it was like a thimble of nuclear force. This was an image of the divine feminine that is so primal. But anyway, so Catholic mysticism, the integral yoga of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, but Catholic mysticism really, I would say, through the lens of Clare and Francis, and then Sufism reoriented, founded by Meher Baba, and that he's pictured there with Mehera, his most important female disciple. And it's these traditions I've been passing over to and coming back and passing over and coming back and finding my home in a certain way between them, in this space between them, this third space, where the Divine Mother holds this, like a string, all these beads. So in the Franciscan allegory, the sacred exchange between Francis and Lady Poverty, Francis, this was written right after Francis's death, soon after anyway. Francis searches for Lady Poverty throughout the streets and city squares. Everyone tells him she's fled to a great and high mountain. To reach her, he and his brothers must strip themselves naked and climb. When they arrive, Francis recognizes her as the Queen of Virtues, the only one who has stayed with Christ when all others have fled. She was with him in the manger. She gave him nowhere to lay his head in his ministry, and most significantly, she alone clung to him on the cross. Lady Poverty is the divine feminine who invites and sometimes pushes us into kenosis, into self-emptying. She strips us of everything we cling to. She empties us completely. But kenosis is not the end. And so the second tradition, the integral yoga of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, might be, I'll mention how I got to discover this tradition in a second, but in Sri Aurobindo, he was a poet, and I was attracted to him precisely because he was using art as a means for spiritual practice and growth. And his major poem is called Savitri, based on a very sort of significant but small story in the Mahabharata. And so anyway, it's an epic poem. And in this poem, the Divine Mother is portrayed, as he calls her, the ambassadress twixt eternity and change, who binds earth to the supreme. She's not only the one who empties us, she's also the one who fills us. Aurobindo's companion and partner in their integral yoga, Mira Alfassa, a French woman who moved to India and became a guru with him. She was he called her the Mother, spent her final years undergoing what she called the yoga of the cells, a radical transformation where her cells were hollowed out, as she described it, and then infused with divine light. She described it as agonizing, grotesque, and the body's lost the ability for walking, for speaking, for thinking, for seeing clearly, physically. But this wasn't merely old age or destruction, but as she described it. It was preparation for theosis, for divinization, for transfiguration, for the body itself to become a true vessel of light. And according to Sri Aurobindo, the Divine Mother in her cosmic state, and he's sort of drawing on different streams of Hindu and Indian traditions here, in her cosmic state, she has four powers, or personalities. Maheshvari, which means, he translates as wisdom. Mahakali, strength. Mahalakshmi, harmony. And Mahasarasvati, perfection. Each one plays a role in both the emptying and the filling to create a new human species and a new creation. Maheshwari's wisdom awakens inner faculties of knowing beyond the lower intellect. Mahakali's divine violence shatters our limits. Mahalakshmi withdraws when we cling to ugliness and greed, awakening us to let go and to surrender to beauty and love. And Mahasarasvati, associated with the feet, with the servant in us, with the flawless work. She is the one who carries every detail of the transformation into material reality to help us walk it into being. The divine feminine here is fierce. She does not ask for permission. She demolishes what must be demolished, and then she builds from those ruins. The third tradition, Sufism reoriented of Meher Baba. The Indian spiritual teacher Meher Baba called this same mystery the nothing and the everything. He taught that God experiences himself through contrast, through the play between fullness and emptiness, knowing, not knowing, light, shadow, male, female. The divine feminine appears as what he called Maya, not as evil or illusion in the negative sense, but as the necessary emptiness through which fullness can be known. And I think to understand his teaching in this way, we might consider a simple image, a mirror. God is the one looking into that mirror, but without the reflective backing of that mirror, the inert darkness, that surface on the back, behind the glass, God could never see his own face. The divine feminine is that inert reflective backing, that necessary darkness that makes seeing possible. So she empties us, strips us of our illusions, our certainties, our grips on things, not to destroy us, but to create the space where light, divine light, and true reflection can be seen and known. And so these three traditions continue to lead me into an insight that guides my art, my teaching, my scholarship in theology today, that the divine feminine is the one who guides the sacred pilgrimage from kenosis to theosis, from emptying to fullness, from nothing to the everything. She strips us naked like Lady Poverty, leading us up the mountain where we've left nothing, where we have nothing left to cling to. She hollows us out like the mother's cellular yoga, emptying our cells of their old habits until they can barely walk. She becomes the dark mirror backing that makes divine vision possible. And then, only then, she fills us. Lady Poverty marks us with her seal, preparing us for the transformation of earth and body into the divine, for heaven to descend and make its home here on earth. The Divine Mother infuses our cells with supramental light, as Aurobindo called it, until matter itself becomes capable of manifesting perfection, divine Sarasvati perfection. The emptiness reveals itself as the necessary preparation for an entirely new creation, evolving now, neither the old matter nor the old spirit, but what the Mother called the new being. This is the Divine Mother's work, not to help us escape earth for heaven, but to bring heaven down to earth, to transform matter and spirit into something entirely new because of this union, a new species of humanity. So both processes, the emptying and the filling, according to these different masters that I pass over and come back to, and their experiences of the process are excruciating. Both require the Divine Mother's aid and support. We cannot empty ourselves without her stripping us bare. We cannot fill ourselves without her light pouring in. And Francis of Assisi understood this. That's why when Lady Poverty asks to see their monastery, he and the brothers lead her to a hilltop and point it to the whole world. This, lady, is our enclosure. They have been emptied of everything, and precisely because of that emptying, the entire world becomes theirs. What was binding becomes spaciousness. What was poverty becomes abundance. What was kenosis becomes theosis. And this is the nature of love, to absorb the whole universe into itself through the sacred pilgrimage, to empty completely so we can be filled completely, to become nothing so we can become everything. And Christ came as love, embodied in this pattern, stripped naked on the cross, with Lady Poverty alone with him, hollowed out in death, and then filled with resurrection light. The divine feminine was there at every stage, guiding the transformation from darkness to light. And so this sculpture taught me about kenosis, about self-emptying, as I was learning it from Steve and his very difficult and very beautiful process of death. But I didn't yet understand it fully. I didn't yet know how to embody it in terms of my method as an artist. This sculpture is still, it's hollow on the inside, but you can't see that. It's a solid form. It's clay. It's heavy with matter. It speaks about kenosis. It's about Jesus stripped and vulnerable, about humanity's reaching need, about God's supporting love. But it doesn't yet enact kenosis in the making. That discovery would come later. But first I had to learn from other teachers of emptiness, from Thomas Merton, from my grandmother, and from a clean rose window that lets light pass through it, that I want to address now. So after The Lover and The Beloved, I made a series of sculptures, each one teaching me something new about vulnerability, about emptiness, about the transformation that comes from letting go. I explored radical vulnerability in the abandonment sculpture, which was the next. So this is The Lover and the Beloved. And the next one I made was just simply to take that corpus and enlarge it. This is about 4 feet tall, and became a sculpture at a parish on Notre Dame's campus. The next one was Sister Fire, Brother Rose. I was inspired by Dante and Francis and Mary, and the fact that for the fire of hell and the fire of the Holy Spirit, the same fire. I was sort of interested in that notion. It torments those who refuse growth, and it gives purification and illumination for those who surrender to that process. And then later I did this piece called The Resurrection, and it was a figure coming out of the earth, going into the earth, that was inspired by an artist in California named Stephen DeStabler, who was making forms much like this, these very kind of primordial human kind of emerging or going into the earth. But still, I hadn't yet found my voice, my method. I was still working with solid forms, trying to express emptiness through gesture and texture rather than through the creative process itself. And the breakthrough came from 2 sources. I mentioned my grandmother and Thomas Merton. When I was a little boy, I would go with my grandma Burge, my dad's mom, and she would in Denver, Colorado. She would take me to a church, St. Dominic's, for Mass on Sunday mornings, and she would always choose the same pew, left side toward the front, and we'd sit there in quiet, waiting for the Mass to begin while she prayed the rosary. And above us was a rose window, simple, just geometric patterns, stone tracery, red, blue, amber panes, nothing elaborate, no saints, no scenes from Scripture. And above us was a rose, but that morning sun would come through, just light, pure light falling on us like grace. And below the window on the altar was a reproduction of the Virgin of Guadalupe, dark-skinned, surrounded by roses. And years later, I read Thomas Merton said this, and it just took me right back, the way he described Mary, in a way that brought me right back to that pew, that plain window, and my grandmother's rosary beads clicking softly in her hands. Merton writes, Mary was empty of all egotism, free from all sin, as pure as the glass of a very clean window that has no other function than to admit the light of the sun. If we rejoice in that light, we implicitly praise the cleanness of the window. That window above my grandma and me, it had no elaborate images, just geometry, glass, transparency, and somehow that made it more powerful because there was nothing to look at except the light itself. And this is when I discovered my method at Notre Dame, reading Merton and remembering my grandma quietly teaching me to pray in emptiness as an 8-year-old or 7-year-old. What if I could make the window, the emptiness, the hollow form, not just represent it, but actually create it through the process of making. So I started experimenting. This is my first experiment, this is my experiment, I guess, in the hollow method. I had a friend of mine lay on the floor, and I pushed clay up against his body, every contour, every muscle, every vulnerable surface. Then I pulled him out. What remained was a shell of his body on the floor, open, receptive, capable of holding light. I loved how the forms looked like the topography of a riverbed, given that this was about Francis, especially. And the next experiment was this woman clothed with the sun, and I was starting to learn about Sufism and the whirling dervishes in Turkey, and so they have a devotion to Mary as well, and so I sort of put her in a whirling dervish pose, and she's pregnant. And this became the first sculpture that truly established my style and method of the hollow form that expresses the experience of kenosis. I modeled the figure of a pregnant clay, Mary, and carefully, precisely, every detail, dancing as a Sufi whirling dervish. I then coated her in wax, in casting wax, a thick layer. Then I cut into it and dug out all the clay inside, destroying the original body I had made, until only the wax shell remained, hollow and empty, but with all the impressions of the original still there, the emptiness that once held the form. Then I cast the emptiness into bronze. The final object was dark-skinned, so really I should have called her the woman clothed with mud, because that's what she looked like on the outside, dark, brackish, the color of earth. But inside, one can see all of her features in the negative. Though they were concave, some of her features looked convex, as if they were coming out. And the emptiness inside, it once held the original clay figure and now was capable of holding light, transmitting it. And I hadn't yet learned, though, the processes of gilding, of lining forms with gold or other precious metals that I would do later. But this was the first step of that kenosis for me was not just a theology or an idea, but it was my creative method. So the transition came with Bede Griffith, so we talked about him yesterday. A student of his just started teaching at Notre Dame when I was there, Brad Malkowski, and he told me about Bede, and so I started reading his works. This is a sketch I did of him. And he was, of course, if you know of his work, you know of his desire to use, I guess he felt the Western framing of the tradition was exhausted, and he wanted a way to find wisdom in these other traditions in India. And he discovered Sri Aurobindo, and the way he talked about Sri Aurobindo was so kind of over the top. I was like, well, I got to see what he's talking about, and I wasn't disappointed. So later, when I was finally getting my master's in fine arts at the George Washington University in 1999, for my master's in fine arts, I was exploring another unique spiritual school called Sufism Reoriented that was chartered in 1952 by Mayor Baba. And this wasn't a rejection, again, of my Catholic faith and formation. It was really an opening, a widening, a deepening. And in 2001, for my MFA thesis exhibition, I made a sculpture called the Nataraj, the Lord of the Dance, based on the traditional Chola period sculptures. This particular one is in the Cleveland Museum of Art, 10th century bronze. And I decided I would, following Bede Griffith's guidance in a little bit, I made the Shiva sculpture who's dancing creation into being and also destroying it out of being. I overlaid that with the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is the God who both creates and destroys, but also the God who is created and destroyed. It's sort of bringing together those insights and what, visually. The piece shows which is right here, of course. This became the front and the back, so when you get a chance to go around it, it's important to see this. This piece shows my process explicitly, a solid clay figure that I destroy in order to achieve the hollow, empty figure. And you can see the stages, the solid body crucified, the encasing, the excavation, the hollow form that remains as the resurrected body, lined with gold. And Shiva and Christ, destroyer and destroyed, creator and created. It became a bridge between my Catholic experience and my Sufi experience, between kenosis and what Sufi mystics call fana, annihilation in the divine. That prepares for baka, or abiding in the divine, between self-emptying and union with God. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay. So, in 2007, I should say, I started a PhD in religion and culture at the Catholic University of America, and I didn't want to do a PhD. I'm an artist. But my Sufi teacher, my Murshida, had been directing me toward this path since 2001. She wanted me to have a more stable future, a tenure track job at a university. I resisted for 5 years. I kept saying, I'm an artist. This would kill me. This would destroy me to become an academic. So finally, in 2006, I wrote to her and asked if I should apply to PhD programs. I wasn't getting a job. And even though I felt it would be impossible to thrive at a non-art world context. And she said yes. So I applied, got in, started in August 2007. And about a week later, Murshida commissioned me to make a 40-foot tall sculpture for our new Sufi sanctuary in Northern California. And the theme was the new being. 2 impossible tasks at the same time. A doctorate and a monumental sculpture. She was sculpting me. It took 9 years. Let's see if I can, yeah. It took 9 years of working simultaneously on a doctorate and an 11-ton bronze sculpture that had to survive California earthquakes. I made the original figure in a 7-foot model, I'll show you, in my studio in Washington, D.C., and then I had it laser scanned and enlarged to full scale using CNC milling technology. Structural engineers ran load paths and earthquake calculations. But the most intensive work was the surface treatment. After the bronze was cast, I spent thousands of hours brush plating gold and other precious metals onto the exterior and the interior, stroke after stroke, pale rose gold building up the layers molecule by molecule. Then platinum on the interior, white, precious metal that never tarnishes, glowing in the hollow. In April 2016, I finished the last gold-plated elements, and a few days later, I flew back to Washington, D.C., and defended my dissertation. 9 years, 2 impossible tasks, both finished within days of each other. So in 2017, the sculpture was unveiled, all 40 feet, all 11 tons. And it stands there empty, hollow, golden pink, with arms wide open. And rising up from the inside, from that hollow interior coated in white platinum, are branch forms, spiraling outward from the heart and the head of the figure. And on these platinum branches are butterflies, 78 in all, 16 that are cast in bronze and gold plated, 62 cast in clear acrylic, like the ones we see here. You can check those out. Those are the small ones. The fiber optic lighting is, and I'll show you this, is on the inside of the sculpture that sort of stops at the knee and sends light up into the chest. So I just want to show you, I guess, a little bit of very short journey of how I made it. This is me making the model in my studio in Washington, making a mold. First rubber, and then this plastic mother mold. It's called a mother mold and a daughter mold. And once that's finished, you have to break this open. And then you can cast. I cast the model into plastic. That became the final piece that was scanned by a laser scan. And then I made the base and made a mold of this. So the base holds all of these forms of evolution, and the idea is that this new being is coming out of the earth and is part of and is the crown and also integrated with the earth. So making a rubber mold of that, a plastic mother mold and so forth. Casting that, demolding. And then once we laser scanned it, then we have this 3-dimensional model that could be used by the structural engineers that did their calculations for the earthquake protection, which means we have these they're called base isolators underneath the sculpture. So during an earthquake, it's sort of like ball bearings. So it kind of moves at the bottom, relieving any stress at the top. And so about 80% of that stress goes right down to the bottom. So that prevents those branches from like becoming like whipping all the butterflies off and potentially harming people in the building. This is an image of the milling of the torso. You set a huge block of styrofoam on this bed of a CNC milling machine, and it carves the piece. And then once it's in the styrofoam stage, then you put clay on top of the surface, or plaster, in this case plaster on the chest and arms, and then clay I put onto the head to get my hand back into, because it looks like a machine made it. That's the base, the different parts. Putting everything together. I put burlap on top of the surface of that base. And I actually modeled this after St. Francis coming out of his robes. And so that base is made of burlap, kind of sack, kind of robe. Then I got them to a certain stage. This was in New Jersey, near Princeton. I forget the name of the town. There's a digital atelier, it's called. They do 3D enlargement and scanning and so forth. We shipped these to California, and then once they arrived, we started making molds of each of these huge pieces. And once, that's the piece that we molded. Once the mold was made, then I could cast each piece into wax. That red substance is a casting wax. And then I used the original to make sure that if any details were lost, I could put them back. So you sort of sculpt this thing many, many times to make sure you get it to what you intend. And once it's in bronze, then it was out of my hands, but because I don't weld, but the welders welded all the pieces together and made sure they fit correctly. And then you have to finish the surfaces, sanding them, both sides. And it's unusual. Typically, when you cast bronze, you're finishing the exterior, but not the interior. In this case, the interior, in a certain way, had to be more finished, more assiduously sanded to a polish that was even more important than the exterior. And then once that was finished, we then craned it into the building. The building was being built at the same time, so we had to synchronize our schedules. And when they were about to close the roof, I had to get there finished and make sure it was going in before they closed. And finally welded it to the base. The base was also craned in. And we had to sort of turn it into the direction that we wanted. Once it was placed in that, this was Murshida, who was my client, my teacher, and that day that we delivered it was an important day for everybody. There's me. So at this point, then it was another year and a half before it was going to be finished. I needed to get some scaffolding in there so that I can do the butterfly work in the branches and hang all of that. So that took another year and a half living on this scaffolding. That was finished. We took that down, and then you saw this. You saw the film. And if you're in Walnut Creek, California, please let me know, and we'll give you a tour. Given the time, I think I want to skip to something. And now I've been reunited with the lover and the beloved. The sculpture I made in 1992, given to Father Dennis, lost track of, and has come back to me through Father John. What we empty ourselves of returns, transformed. What we lose comes back, transfigured. What we give away becomes gift again. This is the mystery, I think, of kenosis leading to theosis. This is the mystery of the hollow form filled with light. Let's see. I guess I just have a closing prayer, if you don't mind. Um, Gracious God, you who made us from dust and breathed life into clay, you who walk with the excluded and call us to do the same, bless these servants in Maryknoll who have given their lives in mission. Bless this community of witnesses who have been hollowed out by love and service, each of them becoming a clean window for your light. Thank you for the reunion with the lover and the beloved sculpture through Father Dennis and Father John through this gathering. May we trust that what we empty ourselves of returns transformed. Give us the courage to create interior space, to empty our need to control, to make room for voices we've silenced, to let light travel through us and out into the world. And may these missionaries know the butterflies are rising now from their very bodies. The light is glowing from within. What was binding has become flight. In the name of the one who emptied himself, who calls us to do the same, who promises transfiguration. Amen. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. I'll bring the mic around to you for questions and follow-up. So thanks to Patrick for this, and I'll give a little bit of a spiel and some time with you to process what he said. But to begin, as we did a little bit last night with the examen in the Jesuit tradition, we're going to do a mode of that, but by way of song. So Patrick is going to help me because he's a wonderful singer, and you may all know it. John tells me you perhaps do. So in honor of the divine feminine and what Patrick has been offering us through his beautiful journey from kenosis to theosis in the process of art, if we could begin with a Salve Regina together in chorus, and Patrick will give us the proper pitch.
Yeah. Is that sol, sol? It's maybe a little high. Yeah. Sol, Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, espes nostra salve. A te clamamus, exules filii Eve, a te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordias oculos ad nos converte. Et Iesu benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis hoc exilium ostende. O thanks, O via, O
Say in Uganda, Amina, right? So, Amina. So Patrick, thank you for that. And for all of you in that spirit of the Salve and the spirit of the examen, let's take just a few more seconds to think about, as we did last night with Declan's talk, what was happening to you internally if you look at your motions and your inner movements, as Ignatius says, as Patrick was sharing his journey. Where in your life has kenosis turned to theosis? So take a minute to think about that. So I'd like to thank Patrick for offering us that journey, and it's just so beautiful to see the process, how actually kenosis happens in the breaking of the mold and the shaping, and also the amount of hours and time and things you had to learn, and the pain of waiting on the scaffolding. Even that, just thinking about that just now, was a good experience for me to know more about you as a friend and a person. And just reminding you that this is all founded for us this weekend in friendship. And so Patrick is part of this group of friends who continue to learn things about each other, which this is my first time seeing this sculpture, and got to carry some of this with Patrick, see it in his office. And I was in San Francisco but missed his piece in Walnut Creek, so I'm ashamed of that. But next time I go, I'll go see it. So, but we have a lot to play with together, with imagery and metaphor and ideas. For example, as I drove in yesterday, this is a region where there are a lot of beautiful birds of prey. In fact, today is supposed to be an eagle fest, but it's paused because of how cold it is. But you might know, and you might remember from the spiritual traditions, how spiraling, right, is an image of so many things, including the rising and the falling. You can think of from Jacob's staircase in art, the way that William Blake depicts that. You can think of the imagery and how it's used in spiritual traditions to think about the soaring eagle, St. John, if you like, right? There's just a lot to be done with just the spiral alone in architecture and metaphor and symbolism and poetry, and in his own piece of art that you saw, the new being here, right? Thinking of the way that for us there is that mode of, maybe again to the reference last night of our cataphatic theology with Declan's disciplined thinking, right? That for us there is a coming to know and then a coming to an unknowing in that spiraling that happens in the self-emptying that Patrick has described for us, right? And that we appropriately began in song, because we know that kenosis in Philippians is probably the earliest song to the Christ figure in Christian tradition, right? So to sing it is appropriate, even though we didn't sing Philippians, to sing something. Right? And to think of that spiraling that our lives, either in or out of control, often are involved in, right? And we even use that to talk about, I'm spiraling out of control, right? Okay. And yet, it is that motion that is so beautifully depicted in Patrick's piece here, The New Being, and reminds us of our own journeys in the process, right? It was St. Augustine who said in the Confessions, Lord, rebuild my broken house, right? Rebuild it, right? Destroy it and rebuild it, precisely the process that Patrick is describing. And so at the core, really, of so many religious traditions is that process of learning that you're not the center, being decentered, being hollowed out, and being prepared to be given something that you don't yet know is even in the gift of your being. Right? And so I'll remind you too, and Patrick used the phrase a number of times, I discovered my method. Remember that methodos in Greek is the way. Right? And so Patrick is sharing us his way. Right? It's not the way, it's the way of Patricius. You have a beautiful, actually, Patrick, I took a picture of this. You haven't seen it yet, I don't think, in the sacristy downstairs. There's a beautiful St. Patrick window. And it says Patricius. So the original name of Patrick, and we were talking about him last night. And so in honor of you and that work, right, there's just as a continuity here, even in our lives, seeing this sculpture that's been here for 20 plus years, and he thought it was destroyed and forgotten, and it's recovered through friendship, right? Is a beautiful sort of narrative of the spiraling, even for us as friends and people, right? And for me, I came across, you have a Capodanno scene here, right? There's a story to be told from me there that I didn't expect to find. And also next to Patricius is St. Boniface. And I worked in a church, believe it or not, in the Orkney Islands that was built in the 12th century called St. Boniface, where we would play accordion, right, as the only instrument that anybody had. And I tried to offer like 3 people a discussion about scripture in the Orkney Islands, way in the north where nobody lived except birds, right? So there's just some strange spiraling going on this weekend in our return here, and I just am delighted that you all participate in that with us and are giving us time to be with you in your hospitality. So thank you for the house and your new being that's being transformed for us and with us. And now, if I can open the floor to you, if you have questions for Patrick, I'll bring you the microphone and you can engage him. John, how much time do we have? 5 minutes? No. Yeah? Okay, so not much time, but anybody like to speak, please?
Thank you. Seeing this sculpture here, I was amazed, and it was a revelation to me to find out its origin. And I thought it's here in the South America room down the hall, and I thought it was a representation of a sculpture that was done in Chile by a gentleman by the name of Irarrázaval. His brother was a good friend of many of ours. We worked together in Peru in the Altiplano, and I was amazed to find out its different origin. I had no idea. Dennis Cleary was a classmate of mine here. But I thought that was a replica of the sculpture called The Hand in the Desert. It's in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, depicting the disappeared and tortured people of the time of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And I was just amazed at the revelation that came in today with Patrick and knowing the origin of this, the true origins.
That's a lovely story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank you so much for Lady Poverty and Lady Wisdom. I think we all remember the spirit hovering over the water in Genesis, and it is a female figure. And the whole thing of God created us male and female, so you have gotten into the more feminine approach, which is very beautiful. And I know in the Book of Wisdom that wisdom, it gives all of the characteristics, and you really have put them forth, and that wisdom will always conquer. That is the closing of that reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm only taking a turn because no one else had their hand up. But Patrick, I've never asked you this, I don't think, and now I'm wondering about the kenotic process of sculpting. And I was really struck when you talked about that first time you dug the body out of Mary's pregnant form. Is that an emotional process for you, the destructive part?
Yes. It's exciting too. It's because you spend hours and weeks and months, maybe depending on the piece, getting the sculpture to be what you want it to be, and you know the whole time, I'm going to destroy this thing. It's going to be excavated at some point. But I am so in love with that hollow form. The thrill of taking clay out of that hollow wax shell, and then discovering the negative image of the face, or the negative image of the breast, or the negative image of the hand or feet. You see that like this. So that's what this is. This foot isn't a. I did this for Mershida to show her. This is actually bronze. It's actually 24 karat gold on the outside, and platinum on the inside. And this was done before we did the whole thing, to show her this is what it's going to look like. This also shows you the actual scale. So if this is just the toes, and this is the hollowed out right foot. And I just love that. I just love how the details that you can see and appreciate in the negative. So I fall in love with this final form so much that I've gotten good about being like Kali and just, destroying. I think that there's a thrill to that destruction, because you know where it's going to go, I think.
Yeah, I've always been amazed and in awe of the artistic vision. I had a classmate when I was in college. Our college was Glen Ellen, Illinois, the seminary college. And by the third year, he realized he was a sculptor. He wasn't a priest, going to be a priest. And it was just amazing. He could see a block of granite and know what he wanted to sculpt. He could see in the granite or the block exactly what it is that's in there that he has to bring out. I presume you have a similar skill, really a gift of being
Obsession.
able to, well, no, I wouldn't say obsession, a
I
gift
would.
of being able to see something in whatever it is and bring it out. Do you want to comment on that a little?
Yeah, I think it's. I say it is an obsession, but it's a divine one. I mean, I think we're all obsessed about something, you know, and I think love is the ultimate one. But I do love doing this, and but there is a sort of a discovery of the ability to imagine, to have a vision of something and want to enact it, to manifest it, and it's such. So John Donne, who was my professor at Notre Dame, modeled this for me of someone who, he was a Holy Cross priest and a theologian and a musician. And the way of words, he talked about the way of words was the path he chose, and he sort of had to say no to the way of music. And then when I met him in the 90s, the two roads were converging for him. And I just thought my way of words and way of art were just converged already. Like I've just been doing those two roads together, sort of braided together. And it always, reading and research and writing led to the imagination being expanded and thinking, oh, I want to talk about X, Y, or Z, and I want to manifest that in wood and in gold and so forth. And then while I'm making these things, I think, oh, I would love to read more about, you know, X, Y, or Z. So I find myself passing over and coming back in those processes, and that they feed each other. And then it's sharing it with you like this. It's another process of teaching and then learning with you. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of, I don't know that any sculptor would have the ability to do what they do if they didn't have that ability to have that vision. And that is tutored by any number of processes. But I think spending time in nature, I think meditation, I think reading, I think friendship, all of those things, I think, you know, terrible experiences, trauma, death, like that with Steve's, you know, just walking with him in those stages of death it was harrowing. And I wept the whole time, and I yet couldn't be more grateful, you know, for what the vision that gave me internally.
Thank you, Patrick. Once again, let's go. Okay, thanks, Patrick. Yeah. And we're going to have just a 10-minute break. There's coffee and muffins behind. And feel free to walk around if you want while you get your coffee to look at the sculptures up here. And and then we come back at 10 o'clock, and Christian Krokus will be doing a presentation on his book for Orbis. And I noticed that Orbis is back here now. So, okay, never miss a chance to sell a book. So we'll see you at 10 o'clock.
He wants the stand, so I'll give him one of these.
Testing, testing. Actually, I want to do something. Does this? Yeah, right, I think like that. I think that'll be good. People can hear that. Yeah, I think that should be okay, right? You can hear, yeah. Yep, okay. Okay, good. Oh, please be gentle. Oh, yeah. I can see it, yeah. Okay, I think that'll be good, yeah. Where's John? This is the microphone.
Where's the other one?
It's on. It's on.
Where's the other one?
Cyrus probably has it.
Okay. All right. If we can begin, I wanted to make just one announcement for people that might know people that were expecting to be able to live stream and join by live stream that it didn't work today. And so, but the talks are being recorded. All the talks are being recorded. And if anybody would like the recordings besides our own community here, but those that like the affiliates and that, I'll try and make sure that we get copies of the talks sent out to them for that had signed up to live stream it. Okay? No. And you're happy about that, right? And again, Christian and I both joined the university at the same time. We were in competition with one another to see who would be hired at the Department of Theology. And besides Christian, myself, and Will Cohen was another one also being thought of to hire, but they hired all three of us. They hired two as tenure track and figured that I would probably be dead by the time tenure happened, so I wasn't hired as tenure, but as a visiting professor. And Christian, when we first started, it wasn't even probably a year into it that Christian arranged for the showing of Gods and Men at the university. And he asked me to talk about mission and how I understood mission after that presentation. And that kind of was the beginnings of a relationship with Christian and his family. And Christian has been an inspiration, again, in terms of Jesuit education, and they use these terms in Jesuit education. One of them is cura personalis, and the care of the whole person, that you're not just teaching, you're trying to form people and dealing with all the elements of their life. And Christian, besides being a theologian and an academic theologian, has also recently taken on the role of studying spiritual direction to be able to integrate spiritual direction into the academic process. And I think all of us have come to just really appreciate how dedicated Christian is to the formation of young people in the faith. So thank you, Christian. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us. Let me add my thanks and for having me. And it's nice to be with the Maryknoll family. And also just a big, warm thank you, especially to John Civilon. He's too humble to say what a major influence he's been, both at the University of Scranton, where he really is beloved, and then in our department and among our friends. He really is, in some ways, the spiritual core of our gathering. And so thanks, John, for having us. But when we first started talking about this, John might have mentioned this last night, but when we first started talking about this gathering at Maryknoll, John pitched it as a retreat. Oops. It's okay. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, no, it's all right. Yeah. So Yeah, just to say, John pitched this as a retreat that he'd be offering to us, and then somehow along the way it morphed into, could you guys do the work, and I will sit back and enjoy what's going on. So maybe it's always that way with John, I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, and listening to my friend and colleague Patrick give his talk, I felt one of the things during the examen was I thought, I want to be that self-emptying and free and personal as Patrick was in his talk, but I'm not there yet. So this is going to be a little more scripted and a little more, I don't know what you want to call it. Okay, so my talk is called Christian de Chergé, The Martyrdom of Love. Most people know Christian de Chergé because of the extraordinary circumstances of his death, and I'll say a little bit about that later, but not everybody knows that he was also a major pioneer in the modern era of Catholic-Muslim dialogue. So as John mentioned, together with my colleague Habib Zanzana, who's on this slide, he himself is an Algerian Muslim, and at the University of Scranton he teaches French and Arabic and Spanish. He and I together translated and introduced these writings of Christian de Chergé for Orbis, so you can see the book back there. And we focused on writings in which Christian explores the relationship between the Church and Islam. So today I'm going to give you just a really brief outline of Christian's life, and then I'm going to mention a few features of his approach to dialogue with Muslims, and then I will talk a little bit about what he called the martyrdom of love, which was his way of thinking about how to live in the face of the dangerous circumstances he and his brothers were facing. Christian was born in 1937 in Colmar, France, which is in the northeastern region, and then he was ordained in the class of 1964 for the Archdiocese of Paris. And then he knew already that he wanted to make this move, but his seminary or his archbishop had him promise that he would serve as a priest in Paris for 5 years, but at the end of those 5 years he transferred to, he entered a Trappist monastery at Agoubel in the Alps in France. And then while he was completing his novitiate at Agoubel, he requested and was granted permission to transfer to the monastery of Notre-Dame de l'Atlas in Tiberine, Algeria. So then he was there, and from 1972 to 1974, he was sent to Rome, where he studied at the Pontifical Institute for the Study of Arabic and Islam. And he came back to the monastery, and then in 1984, he was elected prior of the community, and he held that position until he died in 1996. You may know, you probably know, that during the 1990s, Algeria devolved into just a horrendous civil war in which it's estimated as many as 200,000 people were killed. And the majority of them were Algerian Muslim civilians. During that time, the monks were encouraged both by state and the church either to leave Algeria or to accept military protection of some sort. But the brothers went through a period of discernment, discussions, votes, and together they decided to stay, to remain in the country, and to remain unarmed. On March 27th, 1996, armed men arrived at the monastery and kidnapped 7 of the monks, including Christian. And on May 21st, 1996, those monks were murdered. On December 8th of 2018, Pope Francis beatified them, along with 12 other Catholic martyrs of the Algerian Civil War. I know many people had the chance to watch Of Gods and Men, the film, just a few days ago. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's just an excellent film in itself. I have come to think it's one of maybe the best portrayal of Christianity in a film. I just think it's really excellent. And if you watch it, you will see it's a pretty accurate portrayal of the last days of the monks' lives. But as I said, there's more to Christian de Chergé than those dramatic last days. So I want to say a little bit about some of the features of his approach to dialogue with Islam. And the first one I want to point out is his practice of Lectio Divina. Of course, he was a monk. He's in the Trappist Cistercian tradition, Benedictine tradition. And so he had a regular monastic practice of sacred reading. But he would apply this practice of Lectio Divina not only to the Bible, but also to the Quran. And he described that process of meditating with the Quran as what he called a long apprenticeship to another word, capital W word. And in that process, he reports discovering, quote, as emerging from the Quran, a kind of shortcut of the gospel. I've spent some time with that phrase, and I think what he means is that in his experience, if you stick with it, the Quran can be difficult to enter for someone who's not raised in the Islamic tradition. But if you stick with it, he says, you'll find many verses that facilitate a heart-to-heart connection with God. But then in this passage I'm quoting from, he says next, but quote, it will be impossible to be convinced of that unless we are willing to approach the Quranic text with a poor and disarmed heart, ready to listen to any word that comes from the mouth of the Most High. And that language of disarming is particularly poignant for him. So if you've seen the film of Gods and Men, you may recall a scene in which Saya Atiyah, who is a local leader of a rebel group, approaches the monastery on Christmas Eve. And this is accurate, and he demands from the monastery money, supplies, and Brother Luke. I have more to say about that scene, but I'm not going to do it right now. But in Christian's subsequent reflections about that night, which is quite scary, he says that he started wishing for this guy to disappear, right, because he's such a threat. And he says, then he realized, I can't, as a Christian, pray for his death. So he thinks in the next moment of reflection, but I could pray that he be disarmed himself. And then he says, almost immediately, he realized, I have no right even to ask that he be disarmed unless I and my community are willing to be disarmed. Not from physical weapons, of course, in the case of the monks, but he thought we need to be disarmed of all of our prejudgments about other human beings, about the rebels. They called the rebels the Brothers of the Mountain. That's the name they gave to them. They called the Algerian soldiers the Brothers of the Plain. So to let go of their prejudgments about them, to let go of their biases about Islam, which is so often characterized as inherently violent. And also, he thought to let go of our prejudgments about the value of safety. So from that point on, he said his regular prayer, his daily prayer became disarm me, disarm them. And so that's the notion of disarmed. He thought a disarmed spirit that had to be brought to a Christian reading of the Quran. You have to let it in. A second feature of Christian's spirituality, already mentioned by Cyrus at one point, is the image of Jacob's ladder. And for Christian, you can see there the image. For Christian, the two uprights of the ladder represent the Christian and Islamic traditions. And he would say the bottom of the ladder, he loved to say, is rooted in the manure. Okay, it's in the dirt of the earth. And he said, this is like the everyday existential struggles of human beings. That's where we meet first. But the other part of the uprights are anchored in the same God that we both believe in, the one God to whom we are both oriented. And for the rungs, he thought we ought to think of the rungs as spiritual practices. He was also thinking of the whole spiritual tradition of thinking of the ladder as stages of spiritual development. And so he would say these would be spiritual states, spiritual stages, spiritual practices that many Muslims and Christians would acknowledge as being common between them. And so he thought to help each other, Muslims and Christians, to help each other climb this spiritual ladder, to grow, to develop spiritually, we might not focus on or seek out dogmatic agreement, which we're probably not going to find, but we could encourage what he called mutual spiritual emulation in each other. And in that way, we could encourage each other. The third image here down at the left is because he then thought, if we were to do this, Christians and Muslims, and I think this probably could be transferred to other religious traditions, but if we were to do this, he said, what we'd be doing is forming together a kind of Christian-Muslim communion of saints. So he was very interested in expanding the Catholic understanding of the communion of saints. And he was also convinced that, in a spiritual way, that what we're building here on earth, he thought, is already realized in God's imagination. And what we are doing in this world is simply filling out, making concrete what God is already hoping for us and God has already realized for us in quote-unquote heaven, which is a Muslim, Christian, and others communion. Finally, I want to point out his image of the Visitation, which has become a favorite for me. Duchergé, I think it's somewhat original. Maybe I don't see where he took it from others, but that's not impossible. He said that, like Mary, in the story of the Visitation, who does not understand exactly what's transpiring between the child in her womb and the child in Elizabeth's womb, he wrote, quote, "So it is with our church. It carries within itself the good news. A bit like Mary, first we arrive somewhere to be of service. But then, carrying this good news, we wonder, how should we go about sharing it? And those we've come to meet, we know they're a bit like Elizabeth, themselves bearers of a message that comes from God. Our church has not told us, and in fact does not know, exactly what the connection is between the good news we carry and this message that gives life to the other. My church, for example, does not, this is still Christian, does not tell me what the connection is between Christ and Islam. So I go to the Muslims without knowing exactly what that connection is." That's the end of the quotation. Duchergé then goes on to notice that in the biblical story, after the initial greeting, it's Elizabeth who begins the conversation and elicits Mary's Magnificat. And Christian says, this reflects his experience at the monastery, where he says, we almost never take the initiative. It's our Muslim neighbors who come and talk to us and often share bits of wisdom from the Quran and from the Islamic tradition. And then Christian would pepper his writings and his homilies and his talks with the things he had learned from his Muslim neighbors. Okay, I want to switch now to what he would call a martyrdom of love. Traditionally, probably many of us, I think all of us in this room know that Christians think of a martyr as someone who was killed in odium fidei, so in hatred of the faith. But Duchergé was quite wary of that account because on the one hand, he saw how in Christian tradition, it was used to demonize the non-Christian in whatever the story was. Christian was convinced that glory, reward, whatever word you want to use for that, can never come for a Christian, can never come at the expense of someone else's punition, someone else's condemnation. Love never diminishes, it only builds up. It even builds up one's enemy. So we have to be careful when we think about martyrdom in that way. And then on the other hand, he's living through the Algerian Civil War, and he watched as the Muslims on both sides of this conflict, each were calling their dead martyrs. So he was noticing how the Muslims too were weaponizing the notion of martyrdom in the way that Christians sometimes do, or weaponizing their victimization. So instead, Christian turned to another favorite of mine, who turned out to be a coincidental convergence, this woman, Saint Jane de Chantal. She's a 17th century founder of the Visitation Order of Nuns, and it's from her that he learned this category, martyrdom of love. And the category hinges for Saint Jane on the original meaning of martyr as witness. For Saint Jane, the martyrdom of love consists of all the little, usually hidden ways, ordinary ways, in which one gives oneself in love to one's neighbor without counting the cost. She was asked one time by some of her sisters, this is in a spiritual conference that we have, she was asked to compare this new understanding of martyrdom with the more common one, and she said, quote, "The martyrs of love suffer 1,000 times more by staying alive to do God's will than if they had to give 1,000 lives in witness to their faith." Duchergé frequently, in many of his writings, quotes Jesus in John's Gospel saying, "No one takes my life from me, I lay it down on my own." And St. Jane's notion allowed him to insist that the martyr's life should never be thinking of as taken, it's given. The martyr's life is given. So in his final testament, which was to be read in the event of his having suffered a violent death, and they record it at the end of the film if you've watched it, he writes, quote, "I would like my community, my church, and my family to remember that my life was given, all caps, given to God and to this country. So St. Jane's understanding also spotlights the convergence between a martyrdom of love and obviously a well-lived religious life, a well-lived monastic life in Christian's case and in Jane's case. As the violence of the Civil War began seriously to threaten the monastery, the abbot general cautioned that, quote, our order, this is the head of the Cistercians, the Trappists, he said, our order needs monks more than martyrs. And this became a kind of foil in Christian's imagination because he responded to to the superior general, the abbot general, he responded, there's no contradiction between monks and martyrs. In his last years, he delivered a series of chapter talks to the brothers in which he offers ecclesial and theological rationales for remaining in the country unarmed. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially his argument is, as monks, no one can take our lives because we've already given them to God and to each other. And then he sort of grounds that in the Cistercian vows of obedience, conversion of life, and especially stability, which become sort of the anchors in being able to love freely and joyfully over the long term. For Christian, you can see another image here. Christian, Jesus' washing of his disciples' feet, rather than the crucifixion, functions as the primary symbol of martyrdom, of witness. It captures what's true of the incarnation in general. It's God, in this image of the washing of the feet, it's God giving God's self to us through Christ, not just in a dramatic death, but in acts of love, serving, healing, forgiveness. And also, Christian loved the fact that at the Last Supper, Jesus washes the feet of both Peter and Judas. And spiritually speaking, de Chergé says that Jesus washes the feet of the Peter and the Judas in me. And that's important because, more contextually, despite efforts on both sides of the conflict, the monks committed to a position of neutrality. But Christian would often say, not like Pilate, who feigns to wash his hands of any responsibility. But Christian said, we're going to adopt a neutrality that allows us free, that leaves us free to love everyone, the Peters and the Judases, in the army, among the rebels, in the monastery, and within ourselves. So for Christian, the incarnation of Christ, I mean, this is true for all of us, but he really sort of emphasizes it, is that it's not a momentary phenomenon. It's continuous. God is incarnating, you can see in the image, in Jesus' birth, where am I? Then in Jesus' adolescence, in his early adulthood at Nazareth, in his work, in his play, in his public ministry, in his arrest, in his crucifixion, in his resurrection, all of it is incarnation. So then Christian does the reverse and says, well, if that's true, then all of it is also, in some sense, Christ's passion, Christ's martyrdom. He's been giving himself away in obediential love all along the route, extending and enjoying friendship, but always vulnerable to misunderstanding, rejection, and violence. So he sort of sees a continuation in both directions. At one point, a local official accused the monks of committing collective suicide by staying. So de Chergé, in his next chapter talk, reminds the brother that in the case of Jesus, there was no suicide. Although he chose to give his life freely, he did not kill himself. And he continues, quote, moreover, for us as for him, it was obedience that allowed him to accept the cup of the Father. Now, for Christian, in his understanding, he connects that to a clear call he thought the monks had discerned. They get at this a little bit in the film, that he thought they had discerned a clear call both from their local church, really incredible story to tell about the Algerian Christian church in general, but also from their Muslim neighbors. The clear call was, please stay. And he thought that call was analogous to the call that Jesus heard in the Garden of Gethsemane to accept the Father's plan. And he ends that chapter talk on a note of hope. He says, quote, plus, there's still room in this confrontation with those who threaten us, both as foreigners and Christians, for a conversion of hearts. Let's not forget the price Jesus paid for the conversion of the thief, the or the centurion, or more remotely, us for ours. So like Jesus, the monks were presented with fight or flight options, you could say. They could have calculated which side had the more just cause and supported it. Or they could have retreated to France, as so many others had done. But in deciding to stay, they were motivated by love. I always tell my students in theology, what does love mean? Love means wanting and doing what's best for the beloved, which can be ourselves too. So they decided they were motivated by love. First of all, love for God, to whose mission they had pledged their lives. Ducherge writes, quote, "We are truly being monks by continuing to live here the very mystery of Christmas, God living with men and women. Of course," he goes on, "if that's true, then we have to expect that we too may be exposed to the massacre of the innocents." They were also motivated by love for their Algerian Muslim neighbors and for Algeria as a whole. He writes, quote, "We are tied to the happiness of peace for which the people surrounding us are unceasingly hoping for the entire country. Our neighbors express that hope in particular by continuing to make a place for us, thus refusing to identify themselves with an Algeria that would expel foreigners or an Islam that would execute non-Muslims." So they had a very intimate relationship with their neighbors who often were the reason that the monks were not attacked. They were sort of vouched for by the locals. In other words, there was a kind of a, this is my words, a kind of a mutual falling in love that transvalued their commitments to physical safety, continued ministry, and even life. Those values never ceased being important, but they became subordinate to the values of love, hope, faith, and friendship. So in living the mystery of Christmas and in leaving open the possibility of conversion for even the hardest of hearts, the monks and their neighbors, for me, constitute a historical example of what it looks like, humanly speaking, to extend and to receive God's offer of friendship. I keep mentioning the neighbors because, as Christian Ducherge writes, quote, "This martyrdom of love is not exclusive to Christians." That's important. "We can receive this testimony from anyone as a gift of the Spirit." And he continues, "Behind all the victims of the Algerian tragedy that has all the victims that the tragedy has already counted, who can know how many authentic, quote-unquote, martyrs of a simple and free love there have been? We can think of that man the other day who saved the life of an injured policeman near Notre Dame d'Afrique, the cathedral. A few days later, he paid for that gesture with his own life. Or the Bosnian Muslim who saved his fellow workers. He too risked his life. From further back in time, I can't forget Muhammad, who one day protected my life by risking his own, and who was murdered by his brothers because he refused to hand his friend over to them." That last reference, obviously very personally important for Christian, relates to a story of when he was a seminarian in France. He was conscripted for service during the Algerian War, and he developed a friendship with a local policeman named Muhammad. When some members of the local resistance one day cornered Christian, they were intending to do him harm, this friend, Muhammad, the older policeman, intervened. He actually put his body between them. He protected his young friend. Christian then knew that now Muhammad's life was in danger because he'd protected a French officer against these guys who were in the resistance. So Christian promised to pray for him. It's actually a nice moment. Muhammad teasingly responds, as a Muslim, "I know you'll pray for me, but Christians don't really know how to pray." But then the sad part of the story, the ending of the story, is that the next day Muhammad was in fact murdered. He was found dead. And so Christian, from that point forward, realizes this Muslim man laid down his life for his friend. And he says from there forward, once he was ordained, he couldn't celebrate the Eucharist without mingling the sacrifice of Christ and the sacrifice of Muhammad in his imagination. Okay, lots of death. What about resurrection? After the monks were killed, the war raged for another 5 or 6 years, and the deaths of the civilians continued to mount. But you want to be careful about this. You don't want to go too far. But you can point to a little bit of evidence that there was some good that can emerge from the evil. You don't hope for the evil, but you look for the good that might emerge. For one thing, as John Kaiser, the first to write in English, really a book-length treatment of the monk's journey. John Kaiser reported that after their kidnapping and execution, thousands of ordinary Muslims responded to their death by sending letters of condolence and expressions of shame to the Archbishop in Algiers. And he concludes, quote, this is Kaiser, in retrospect, there were many signs that the monk's death had indeed been a turning point. For a country that seemed drunk on violence, their assassination in God's name was, for many Algerians, like hitting rock bottom. It was the final and highly publicized insult to an already abused Islam. Even some of the militant rebels withdrew their support from the leader who had signed off on the kidnapping and murder of the monks, and the attacks on foreigners and Christians do seem to have abated somewhat. Another consequence, this one more long-term, was the eventual, as I mentioned, beatification of the Catholic martyrs of the war. So now we have these blesseds who witness to a more authentic notion of martyrdom and embody dramatically, I think, Nostra Aetate's call for Christians and Muslims to leave behind patterns of violent rivalry and instead work together for mutual understanding, peace, and the common good. So now we have beatified examples of what that looks like. Before concluding, I want to mention just two comments of Christian de Chergé on the cross. Am I doing okay? This first one is from a 1993 homily on the Feast of the Cross. De Chergé is narrating a conversation that he had with a Muslim Sufi friend. And I put the text up there, but it's too small. But try to pay attention. It's a back and forth. So the Sufi friend begins, and what about the cross? I was now Christian. I was asked recently by one of our Sufi friends, what if we were to talk about the cross? Which one? I asked him. The cross of Jesus, obviously. Yeah, but which one? When you see an image of Jesus on the cross, how many crosses do you see? Maybe 3. 2 for sure. There's the one in the front and the one behind. And which is the one that comes from God? The one in front. And which is the one that comes from men? The one behind. And which is the more ancient? The one in front. It's like this. This is the Sufi. It's like this. Men could not have invented the other except that God had already created the first. And what's the meaning of this cross in the front, this man with arms outstretched? The Sufi again. When I stretch out my arms, he said, it's in order to embrace, to love. And the other, Christian asks. The Sufi responds, it's the instrument of love that is now distorted, disfigured, hatred, fixing in death what was the gesture of life. The Sufi friend had said, maybe 3. This third cross, Christian now reflects to his brothers in the homily, wasn't it I, wasn't it he, making the effort which drew both of us to separate ourselves from the cross behind, the cross of evil and sin, in order to cling to the one in front, the cross of victorious love? To get that story, you have to know that Muslims typically deny the crucifixion of Jesus. But the power of it, I think, is that despite the doctrinal objections, Muslims may already understand and embrace something of what the cross means to Christians. And perhaps more importantly for de Chergé, the exchange itself was an instance of embracing the more ancient cross, the one created by God. The very act of coming together, learning, seeking points of convergence, is already to participate in the open-armed embrace of Christ and to leave behind, this is important, to leave behind the fear, the shame, and the insecurity that cause us to deny the voice and dignity of others. The image on the slide is the cross that Christian de Chergé commissioned for the monastery chapel precisely because he thought it would be more inviting to Muslim sensibilities. So you can see that it's a resurrected Christ, and the crown of thorns is absent, and the nails in Jesus' hands and feet are replaced by points of light. Very briefly, I want to just give you 2 lines from a 1987 Good Friday homily from Christian, which I share with my classes now. He writes, so this is to get at 2 ways of seeing the cross. He writes first, yes, the cross is a sign of horror and provokes aversion. Do not do to others as you have done to me. Yes, the cross is also a sign of unimaginable love that provokes conversion. Do to others as I have done for you. Okay, finally, I just want to mention the beatification ceremony, which was held in Oran, Algeria in 2018. Many Catholic officials, including Vatican officials, were skeptical that the Algerian government would allow it to be held there. A lot of negotiating was prepared. They thought it's going to dredge up terrible memories. It may potentially shame the Algerians, or maybe it's going to make for a kind of a French savior complex that is going to endorse that. But in the end, the Algerian government did allow it. And from what I've read, apparently as many as 50% of the attendees were Algerian Muslims at the beatification ceremony. In his final testament, Christian had said he didn't want to be labeled a martyr if it would mean adding, quote, to the indiscriminate scorn that is already heaped upon the Algerians. Knowing the attention his death would receive, he asks that we, quote, associate his death with so many other equally violent ones, which are forgotten through indifference or anonymity. My life, he writes, has not the innocence of childhood. And many readers may not know, that's not just pious talk. He was acknowledging his own role in the French colonial legacy of Algeria, and that was responsible for so much of the violence that now they were suffering under. And he's trying to redirect his readers' attention away from the few French Catholics and toward the many Algerian Muslims who suffered in large part because of that colonial legacy. I often think it's a question as to whether an institution that has been deeply responsible for a social problem can also be part of its solution. It's a question. Last image. This is the official icon that was written for the beatification ceremony. I don't know how well you can see it. You can come up and look at it later if you want. On the one hand, you could look at it and you could say, oh, look at this, the 19 Catholic martyrs. The church is still paying attention to the white European few rather than the Algerian Muslim many. But you can also see that the artist has included one unhaloed person. He's down in the lower right corner. And his name is Mohammed Bouchiki. He was the Muslim driver and friend of Bishop Pierre Claverie, who was the Bishop of Oran. They were killed together when their car was bombed. Their blood literally intermingled. And while it wouldn't be appropriate for the church to claim Muhammad for itself, which a halo may be perceived to do, it does seem important and seems an important gesture to include him in some way. Now, you might know, there are progressive Catholic artists, and maybe we have one in the room, who like to paint non-Christians as saints. But I think doing this as in such an official capacity, I think this is a first. And perhaps, because this was the official, this was commissioned by whoever commissions beatification ceremonies. And I'd like to end on this just to say that I think in that gesture there may be a glimmer of the kind of self-awareness and the kind of mutuality which so many Algerians, including Christian de Chergé and the monks of Tiberine, died, lived, and loved. So, thank you. And here you have a few pictures of Father John Sivalon holding court in Turkey on a trip that we took in 2011 together.
Yeah. Thank you, Christian. Beautiful. So let's begin with a note that he began with, I think, and that dovetails well with Patrick's talk. These are two old friends. They're actually, Christian introduced us to Patrick after their very long friendship. And so we've been invited into something even more precious and ancient to us in their gift. So I'll just tie two things together so that we can meditate on it for a moment. If you noticed in one of Patrick's sculptures, the wounded side, if I read this correctly, of the pierced side of a version of the Christ was in the bottom of one of your sculptures. And out of that blood, which was reaching around the sculpture, is something to think about for a moment. Christian began with a note about wounds and letting go and vulnerability. So I'd like you to remember that poem/song, we're not sure of its origins, the Anima Christi, the soul of Christ, it says, hide me in your wounds and heal me, right? And that term in Latin for wounds is vulnera. So when we are vulnerable, we are exposing our wounds to one another and asking, like a Thomas before Christ, to actually intermingle in those wounds and find our space there, which sounds super strange and difficult and painful. And yet, I think our experience, even last night, being here together as friends again, and we went from joy to sharing wounds and healing each other, right? So take some time for the moment to just think about, for you, what that means in the context of the letting go of Christian de Chergé that Christian opened with. Hide me in your wounds. So thank you. I'd like to just way before we get to a question or two, Christian, for you. In light of the film, I just want to ask something. So really what I'd like to circle around for the moment is to bring traditions together would be discernment. So beautifully in the film, they depict communal discernment. I'll just say, if you want to talk to Christian about this later, he's also been involved in a very difficult process of listening, which I know Francis has done for the church, or did for the church. And that is resonant with the Shema, right, of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel. Like, it's a listening, right? We need to listen for God's voice. The monks listen for discernment in the film. And then they're left, each person, to decide on their own, though, whether they will remain or go. Right? And so there's beautiful scenery about that in the film. And then, if you know Benedictine tradition, we don't do it here when we eat, but I've often thought as a parent of children how nice it would be to have somebody read while you're eating, because meals are chaos, often in big families. But the tradition of reading while you eat is a way to sort of to help communal life and also to center your time together and to use it differently. But as the monks in that film are deciding, one monk stands up and puts in Tchaikovsky's Black Swan. This is sort of a film decision. It's not really necessarily a decision that we know about from the community, but it's a film decision to use Tchaikovsky's Black Swan as the music where they have a glass of wine and know they're going to die. So I don't know, do you want to say anything about martyrdom of love in that context and the beauty of kind of how the film is using some of this cultural material art and ballet and it's the physician, Brother Luke, right, who puts that in the film. I don't know if there's something you'd like to say about the martyrdom of love and the witness that provides.
Yeah, thanks, Cyrus. I haven't found, let me just start as professor, I haven't found any references to that being historical. Okay, so I do think it's probably a decision of the scriptwriter and director. But what it captures is the process or the culmination of a process at which I think the men were freed of, I mean, never totally freed, but in some sense freed of the anxiety and the terrible conflicting feelings they had about staying or leaving. And there's a kind of a release in that scene, I think, which is true to their experience. I love that scene, and I choke up and cry when I see that scene. So I think it's just brilliant on the part of the filmmakers. I guess I'll just say this, because if you see the film, you might pick this up, but you might not. Well, maybe you pick it up. Brother Luke was fairly resolved from the beginning that he was prepared to stay no matter what the consequences were. And I have come to think that Christian was too. He was constantly in dialogue with the other brothers and was making space for everyone to arrive at their own judgments and decisions, but always kind of saying, well, yes, we're all deciding, but we're all going to decide together. Whatever we decide, we're going to do together. And then he kind of moved away from that a little bit. He said, well, even if everyone were to go, maybe one of us would stay. I don't know who, but maybe one of us would stay. But of course, he meant himself. I think he was convinced both that he would stay and that the others would stay as well. So I don't know. Somehow that's also captured in the scene.
Yeah, thank you. And then I did notice I have some old notes from watching the film because of you. That there's a passage from the Quran about dwelling together well as neighbors that he uses in the film. And then there's the scene where they're sitting with the community and talking about the local community member says, we grew up around the monastery. We are the birds, you are the branches. So please stay, right? So
And that's historical. That happened. That conversation happened. Yeah.
So this is back in the back there. This is Christian's book, so if you want to see it, just had to give a shout out to that for you. And before I hand over the mic to some of you, I would like to end on a note, though, about so Christian's sharing some of his study of this in his work, but I think also you should know in his life the kind of hospitality he's talking about and witnessing to in others' lives is part of his life. And I thank you for your hospitality over the years, and we all benefit from that, eating together and living together and working together very closely. And so I think you should know that this is kind of also close to Christian's own life as a witness himself. So thank you. And ties us together in this theme of welcoming one another into each other's spaces. So we had a question back here, though, to start. Yeah.
Maybe more of a comment than a question, but including probably a question too. Thank you very much for your sharing of yourself and your efforts. And your talk brought back to me we were a little group of Maryknolls who went to the Middle East and started in Egypt and later Yemen and the Holy Land. But I'm happy to see that the progress that's come along, Christian, Muslim, for example, the gathering for prayer together with many other religions, and Assisi was one thing, and Pope Francis, I don't remember before him, but Pope Francis, when he got to Egypt, it was an important part of his visit was to meet with the Grand Mufti, and one of the highest, most respected Islamic leaders, Muslim leaders. So to see those hopeful signs that are there, and just personally, I conclude with this. It was typical, a very, very typical Egyptian attitude and conveying of friendship. I remember a discussion. I happened to be walking. We lived mostly in Cairo, so sometimes I had to get out of there. And a couple of train stops away was out into the country, so I was there, and some Muslim farmers were gathered together and sitting together, and they called me over for tea and some other little things they had to eat. And those who have met Muslims at all, I think, could identify the experience of first they ask your name, then they ask your country, and the third one, are you a Muslim? And I very honestly said, no, I'm a Christian. And one who was somewhat the leader there, I think, he said, oh, well, that's a good religion, too. So
It's a great story.
there's a lot of hope around, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I'll just say in response, you read when you do a project like this, and I'm continuing with Christian de Chergé. This in a way, this book of translations was to prepare myself to write a monograph on his spirituality. But as you go through and you draw close to the person you're studying, and you discover the person more and more as you're reading more and more. And what I came to realize is, gosh, he was really stubborn. And it annoyed the guys in the monastery too. But one of the ways that he was really stubborn was he was stubbornly hopeful. And people were constantly in letters and conversations, people are pointing out, yeah, but what about this, kind of pessimistic questions about the relationship between Christians and Muslims, France and Algeria, whatever, and he just was stubbornly hopeful about what could be.
We just passed the 60th anniversary of the Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate. You mentioned it very, very briefly. Did that awareness that was growing in the church, how did that affect the decision of the monks to go and to stay? Do you have any insight on that or any knowledge of that?
Yes, I've written on this. But I'm going to say very briefly that, this is already not brief. Yes, it's the atmosphere in which Christian himself is operating. So he's very much a product of Vatican II. He's very much a product of Nostra Aetate. He takes it as the church's way and is implementing it. I think what's interesting, maybe just to mention quickly, is that not everybody was on board in the monastery with Christian-Muslim dialogue. Some of the guys kind of begrudgingly tolerated it. Some of them became quite annoyed with how sort of pushy Christian was in terms of how much dialogue we should be doing. He mentions that one of the guys responds up to the, so he was the prior, and they'd be assigned abbots from other monasteries in France, and one of the guys complained to the abbots that he's proselytizing, so it's too much Islam, and he had to back off a little bit. So yes, for him, Nostra Aetate, full force. For the others, I think kind of a more gradual process. One of the other monks, Christopher Le Breton, whose diaries are also now published, sorry to mention this, by Collegeville, by Liturgical Press. But Christophe Le Breton was on board too. So the two of them were really pushing the dialogue aspect of the monastery's ministry.
Okay. Yes, as followers of Christ, we look to Jesus Christ to how to face our death. And we always come up with his intimate relationship with Abba and going to the solitude, going to the silence. I thought it was a really great model of how the community faced their death. That those times of prayer, even in silence, when the helicopter was going around, and taking a walk with one-on-one, their reading, the chanting of the Psalms. So I think that's one of the things, they were going for their own diminishment, but they were receiving it, absorbing it in Christ, and how important that is to lay aside your fears through community, through silence, and through prayer, and ultimately through Eucharist, and they were ready.
Yeah, thanks. That's a beautiful way of putting it. And just to reiterate that the freedom from the fear of death is ultimately for him and for us about living love now, here, and recognizing that Jesus wasn't looking to die, Jesus was looking to love, and that's what we're called to.
I think we're short on time because 11 o'clock is a hard stop. Not that Christian's going anywhere, so you can keep discussing with him, but I'd like to give it to John just so he can close out for us, so that 11 o'clock is a hard stop for folks.
Yeah, I think the reason 11 o'clock is a hard stop is there's a liturgy at 11:15, and people are welcome to join in that liturgy. I wanted to say just, again, appreciation for Christian, the picture that he showed of this trip to Turkey was because of his relationship to a Muslim group that is was centered in the Poconos. The leader of the group, Gulen movement, paid for our trip to Turkey and allowed us to visit many sites of Turkey, both Christian and Muslim, and to also get a greater understanding of what they were fostering in Turkey itself. And it was a fascinating trip to go to places like Ephesus and see it and to think of it. And what are you raising your hand? All right. But again, I want to express my appreciation to all four of the people and who put the time and effort into this. This originally started as we just go and have a conversation, and then they volunteered to do presentations. and But again, I hope you have gained an appreciation for what I have experienced with these people and others at the University of Scranton, and what a pleasure it's been for me to be a part of that community for all these years, and to have the support of these people on that journey. The Porch community has been a source of inspiration, life, and nourishment for me. And it's always great to come back, but it's also been a pleasure for me to be able to share with you that this is part of my life and has been a part of my life for these years. So thank you very much. I don't know if we're staying afterwards or not, after lunch. Well, after lunch, if anybody wants to join, we'll be available for conversation if somebody wants to come and have a conversation. Is that agreed? Yep, okay. All right. I feel like we're not all, anyway, we'll see you. Thank you all.